Hey, what's going on, Chasing Elephants family? Hey, I'm back with you for part 2 of our YPS All Access exclusive podcast edition. So, last week you got a chance to hear from our friend Megan Faye Marshman. This week you get to hear from our friend Pastor Drew Worsham. Drew is an incredible pastor and leader in the San Antonio area. And listen, if you really are wanting to know about how to deal with moments where you got to step away as a leader and really reflect on what the Lord is doing in your life, because sometimes we run so hard that we run right into burnout. And Drew's session is phenomenal on how to kind of pay attention to some markers, some indicators of if we're going down a pathway that will lead us to a place of burnout, and how to push back and to be reflective in that. And so I'm excited to have you guys hear from our friend Drew Worsham. So without further ado, Chasing Elephant podcast family, here is my friend and yours, Drew Worsham.
Like, we know something cool has happened in our lives, especially when we meet Jesus, we're following Jesus. But for the vast majority of us, we look at our lives and it feels incomplete. It still feels a little confusing. It still feels a little broken. And I have to venture that I'm not alone in thinking that many of us are like, surely there's a little bit more. Surely there's a little bit more. On August 5th, 2010, a copper mine in San Jose, Chile caved in, leaving 33 Chilean miners trapped 2,300 feet below the Earth's surface. And search and rescue teams began to drill down to see if anyone had survived and found their way to the rescue shelter. And then 17 days, 2.5 weeks in to the search and rescue, one of the drill bits came out of the ground, and written in red paint was this phrase: "We are well in the shelter," signed the 33. So countries across the world began to leverage their resources and technology to help figure out if they could possibly save these 33 men, including the USA and our NASA. In 69 days into this process, 69 days after being trapped, all 33 miners made their way to the surface one at a time. And over the course of the next few months, these men found themselves on news channels, late night shows, telling their story about how they survived. And then we slowly went back to our normal lives, and they tried to do the same. And 1 year after their rescue, Time magazine wanted to check on the miners to see how they were doing. And so they flew down, and a few were doing okay. But that wasn't the case for the massive majority of them. One of the men had just been arrested the day before they got there for domestic violence. Every one of them was wrestling with sleep issues, panic, anxiety disorders, PTSD. Some were dealing with drug and alcohol abuse. Some had started hoarding food or choosing to sleep on the hard floor instead of the bed. And one miner that they interviewed had started building a wall around his house. And when they asked him why, he said, "I have no idea." Which led them to write an article called "Do the Miners Need a Second Rescue?" Do the miners need a second rescue? Because the truth is, they were free, but not really free. And I think as followers of Jesus, as leaders in the church, if we're really honest, I think many of us know how to live lives forgiven, but very few of us know how to live lives that are free. And there is this spirit of slavery that pervades our nation, our churches, and is unbelievably present in so many leaders of the church. And whether it's a scarcity mindset, it's people-pleasing, it's approval-seeking, applause-chasing, performance anxiety, worry, or fear, whatever it may be, all of it comes from a spirit of slavery, not freedom. And sure, your wrist and your ankles may be free, but many of our hearts are not. And we think about things that Jesus promised. And Stuart says, like John 10:10, that I've come to give you life and to give it to the fullest. Or Matthew 11, where he says, hey, my yoke is easy and my burden is light. And if you're weary and you need rest, come to me and I'll teach you how to walk in that rhythm of rest. And many of us, if we're really honest, we kind of want to call BS on some of those verses. Or we go, that's cute, but we just haven't cracked into it or tapped into it. And then what happens for many of us when the wheels fall off or the bottom falls out on many of our hopes and our dreams? And our lives feel like our ministries or our marriages feel like they've just kind of shattered on the kitchen floor. Or to borrow a biblical metaphor, maybe you're not in Egypt anymore, but where you are now sure as heck doesn't feel like the promised land. And all you see is sand. Well, my wife and I, we lived in the Pacific Northwest for a little over a decade. We were in Washington State and moved out there as a church planter. And a team of us, we planted a church, and by God's grace, it worked. And we connected with the North American Mission Board, and then we planted another church, and then another church. And my 10 years there, we planted 14 churches. And then as we left, I think there were like 20-something churches that have been planted to that network. And 2017, God started stirring in our heart, and we felt Him moving us to San Antonio, Texas, to do something similar. And so we moved to San Antonio, Texas, was a college pastor at one of the largest churches in America. I tell you that so that you're a little impressed. And then in 2019, we planted a church in San Antonio. And opening day, no advertisement, 1,200 people show up. And we have to go, okay, hey, just go get coffee and come back in an hour and a half. We'll do it again. That whole week, man, I got Montel Jordan just blaring in the speakers of the car, like, this is how you do it. Like, if I'll write the book, like, we figured it out. We've tapped into it. And then 6 months into the journey, a global pandemic screeches all of it to a halt. And like Stuart mentioned, whether it's the political unrest or the reopening of our country's deepest and darkest wound of racial tension, trying to navigate and lead through all of that. And then in 2020, right in the middle of the pandemic, we would end up replanting the church and starting completely from scratch. 2021, my family was hit with like pretty deep and traumatic and dramatic news, like which I'm not like at liberty to like really talk about at this stage, but like was so crazy and weird, like that there's like 2 Netflix documentaries about it. Like not like distant family, like in our home. Like a couple months later, we have our second child, our son Lyndon, who's born a little early and born with special needs. Have to rush him into the NICU, can't breathe on his own. In that process, we find out he's got 3 holes in his heart and 3 brain hemorrhages. We lead through a wild journey of kind of walking through all that entails. And guys, I'm totally in these moments, like we were totally in the wilderness, but just trucking along. And the whole time, the ministry is growing, the church is growing. We're having impact on the University of Texas in San Antonio. We're having impact in the refugee community, impact in our community. People are surrendering their lives to Jesus. Disciples are being made. And then in September of this past year, I have a life-altering wake-up call. One of those Pete Scazzaro moments where my wife looks at me essentially and says, Drew, I'm done with our church. Which I respond with, our church is amazing. Like maybe one of the best in the nation. Like I'll put it up against anybody's. And she's like, yeah, the church is great. The problem I have is with the pastor. I don't trust you. And there's this gap between who you desire to be and who God's called you to be and who you actually are. Selfishness, unhealthy lack of boundaries, the spinning of the truth, mistrust. And in that moment, man, my whole world came crashing down. And I look back, 6, 7 months ago, and the most unhealthy, unhealthy at every level. Physically, worst shape of my life, emotionally unwell, spiritually dry. Marriage was fragile. Like I'm surrounded by people, but completely alone. And in these last 6-7 months, it has been a wild journey, to say the least. We went to the leadership of our church, and they started walking with us. We started individual counseling, marriage counseling, started working out, diving into community, and like right now, like I'm currently a little over halfway through a 4-month sabbatical. So I share all of that to tell you that what I'm about to share with you is not coming from a place of arrival. Like I'm knee deep into this like path of healing. Like we're in it. I'm currently in the wilderness, journeying through the desert. This is the second time I've shared any of this with any humans. And like this is really like St. John of the Cross, like, or like, the dark night of the soul is what we feel like we're walking through. And if it's okay in our short amount of time together, I just want to share with you what God has been teaching me. And this will be a little unrefined, unpolished, because we're in it, but this is what God has put on my heart. Like we're in this wilderness. And what I've learned about the wilderness, and I mean, you guys know, the story of the scripture, that God rescues his people out of slavery, out of bondage, out of Egypt, and he leads them into the wilderness. And the wilderness is hard, and it's miserable. And the hardest part of walking through the wilderness, it's not the sand. It's not the desert. It's the wandering. It's the not knowing. It's this dependency that's being built in us to fully rely on God. Like, God, if manna doesn't show up in the morning, we die. If there's not a cloud, if there's not a pillar of fire by night, like, we're lost. Like, we got nothing to hold on to. And it is human nature to want to go back to Egypt. Like, something I've never thought about until these last few months? Like, Pharaoh's dead. His entire army is dead. You have all the plunder. Of course you want to go back to Egypt. If you go back, you're kings and queens. You get to rule it. The problem is, you still have a spirit of slavery. And just because your position changes doesn't mean that spirit changes. And it's only a matter of time before you start acting out of that spirit of slavery. Start demanding performance from others and yourself before you start treating others less than. But it's in the wilderness that God begins to not only get you out of Egypt and Egypt out of you, but to actually move you from a spirit of slavery into a spirit of sonship. Because hear me. Slaves don't get the inheritance. Only sons get the inheritance. Only sons get what's promised. And so this journey has been unbelievably hard and scary and lonely and heartbreaking, but at the same time, it has been insanely beautiful and filled with intimacy. It's like I'm reminded of Hosea 2, where the scripture tells us that God says, I'll lead her into the wilderness and speak tenderly to her. That it has been a beautiful and really difficult season. But the whole point is for God to move us from slavery to sonship. This is Leviticus 26:13, if you're taking notes. When God says, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt so that you would no longer be slaves. And I broke the bars of your yoke and enabled you to live in freedom. And my fear this morning, honestly, in sharing this, what God has put on my heart, is that many of us may kind of be like, cool, Drew. Like, that's super cool, but that's really meta. Like, it's really like that whole, I don't know about the whole spirit of slavery and the orphan. I don't know if that really applies to me. And I'm learning that maybe it's a lot closer than any of you realized. And so this morning, I just want to share with you 3 lies that every slave believes. And I think a lot of us this morning will find ourselves identifying with one of the lies, if not multiple of the lies. And so I just want to share this, and then I'll give you some hope, okay? So, 3 lies that slaves believe. If you're taking notes, number 1 is this: I'll never have enough. I'll never have enough. I'll never have enough money. I'll never have enough resources. I'll never have time or energy. Think Numbers 13, when the Israelites come up to the border of the promised land and they send in the spies, and how they respond to it is this. They say, we don't have enough strength. We don't have enough height. We don't have enough weapons. It's immediately, we don't have enough. It's a scarcity mindset that leads us to worry and anxiety and fear. And that is a spirit of slavery or a spirit of orphan. Think about this. Like many of you, you've adopted children in your house, or maybe you were adopted. But listen, legally, that child is a part of the family. They're adopted. The court of law says this is your child. But yet they sit at the table and they still hoard food. They still sneak it in their pocket. They have a drawer in their room where they stash snacks. Why? Because even though they've been adopted, there's still a spirit of orphan on them. And many of us live with this scarcity mindset, that we don't live lives that are open-handed. Why? Because yes, we've been adopted into the family. Yes, that's true. But we're still living with the spirit of orphan on our lives. This is why Exodus 16, God commands his people about manna that you only get for today. You only collect for today. If you have any extra, it's going to get gross. And what do the Israelites do? They're sneaking it. They're putting it in different baskets. Why? Because they're still slaves. They're still orphans. My daughter's here this morning, and Tilly, she's 4, and one of my favorite things about my daughter is if you were to come over to our house and hang out, and you're our friend, and you're playing with Tilly, inevitably she's going to hand you something that's hers, it could be her candy, that she got from Easter, and she's like, hey, this you can have this. It could be like a Barbie doll. You're playing with it, and you're like, you like that? It's yours. Take it. And we're like, hey, sweetheart, hey, candy's cool. Barbies are expensive. Let's not. True story. Her response, Dad, we can just get more. And I love that. Why? Because my daughter is living with an abundance mindset. I can live like this. I can give it all away. Why? Because my daddy will get me more. Is that how we live? So I can give away my time and my energy. I can give away my love. I can give it away. My resources. I can give away my money. I can give away my intellectual property. I can give it away. Why? Because my dad will get me more. Because I'm a son. I'm a daughter, and he takes care of his kids. Are we still hoarding? And one of the things I've learned in this spirit of scarcity, really it's just a spirit of fear, is that the action that God is inviting me to in this season, and I think it's probably true for you, but it's for me, is that freedom is learning to actually be brave. We all know the fear nots that are in the Bible. Galatians 6:9, don't grow weary of doing good, of living this open life. Be brave, stay in it. And in counseling, one of the things that I learned, and this may be very common knowledge, it's new to me, so if you're like, Drew, every pastor uses that illustration at one point. Cool, I didn't know that, okay? But in Colorado, it's one of the only places in the U.S. where you've got the mountains and you've got plains. And so it's one of the only places where there's actually buffalo and cows that kind of commingle in some of the same areas. And what's interesting about these is storms happen a lot because of the mountains and into the plains, and they always usually come from the west and go east. Well, what's interesting is cows, when they see the storm, they turn in the opposite direction and they start to walk away from the storm, which makes sense. Many of us, that's how we live our lives. Something hard comes, wilderness comes, we want to walk away from it. But what's crazy is as the storm moves with it, The cow actually stays in the storm much, much longer compared to the buffalo that actually faces the storm and starts to walk towards it. And so though it may be slightly more intense, its bravery makes the pain a lot less. So my encouragement to you, church, if that's your lie, be brave. Press into what God is doing. Trust his heart and trust the process that he's walking you through, especially if you're in a wilderness right now. So first lie, never have enough. 2, never be enough. That slavery says, I'll never be enough. So this is a fear of abandonment. This is your people-pleasing, addiction to approval, attention, affirmation, shame, lack of boundaries, okay? This one, big on my list, okay? This is Numbers 13. Once again, same story outside of the promised land, and what their comparison is like, hey, we're grasshoppers. Like, we're just grasshoppers compared to, it's this identity statement that this is who we are. And since we feel like we're not enough, we assume that no one around us really loves us for who we are, so we have to perform for others' love. And so the more people are clapping for us, that equates, they really love me. The more likes we get, the more we're loved. And this is not sonship. It's a spirit of slavery. And the root of this lie is ultimately shame. And shame pushes us into hiding. This is Genesis 3. And when we hide, don't miss this, really one of 2 things happens to us. That we become less than human, and so we put on a victim mindset. Every victim mindset, every victim phrasing is just slavery. It's just a spirit of slavery. So we become a victim, we become less than. Or we have to become more than. We have to become superhuman. We have to be the pastor that has no needs and has no limits. And so we become a hero. And the truth is, what's really crazy, when you live in this almost masked version of yourself, not reality, because you do have needs and you do have limits, but when you push against those and try to convince everybody that you don't, it's still slavery. Give you a quick example. In the 2012 film, The Dark Knight Rises, it was Christopher Nolan's version of Batman with Christian Bale. Amazing. There's a scene where they're at this masked gala, and everybody's got these little masks on, and Bruce Wayne is dancing with Catwoman, Anne Hathaway, and he doesn't have a mask on. So she asks him the question. She says, "Who are you pretending to be?" And he says, his response is, "I'm Bruce Wayne, eccentric billionaire." And this is crazy. The reason that scene, which many of us may have missed, was such a big deal for the director, for Christopher Nolan, is that he wanted to communicate that because of Bruce Wayne's childhood trauma and deep-seated shame, that Bruce actually considers Batman his true identity, and Bruce Wayne is the mask that he wears for the world to see. Meaning, for Bruce Wayne, the true self, the true being, the only person worthy of love that he ultimately never got from his parents because they passed away, is the person hiding behind a mask all alone trying to prove that he's more than human. Performance is not love. And so action here is we have to learn, and students learn to be honest, learn to tell the truth. And here's the deal. I'm an Enneagram 7, ENFP. I am pain avoidant to the max. Silver lining on everything. And I mean it. Like I really believe it. I'm not trying to spin it too much. But in my counseling, what I've learned is that I live in a distorted view of reality. If you would have looked back 7 months ago and you'd been like, "Drew, how's things going?" I would have been like, "Mostly good. Mostly good." I was a little hard. Trying to figure out the church plant thing, but we're good. How's your son's health? Mostly good. But it's a distorted view of reality, and the truth is, God doesn't meet us in the illusion. He meets us in the reality. And we all, I think, have a tendency to keep secrets. And that may play out in different ways. Like it may be in your actions. Like can I just be really honest? This fall, I sat down with my wife and just was really honest with a secret that I'd had in my life that like no one knew about it. Like not a soul in my life knew about it. That 2 years into planting a church, the stress and all that stuff, like I started using nicotine products. Little pouches that I could like hide in my backpack and no one knew where they were. Like I could have one in and like no one would know about it. Like it was so discreet and I could hide that. And I'm not saying anything about nicotine. The problem was that I was able to keep a secret and no one knew about it. And the truth is, we're only as healthy as the secrets that we're able to keep. Like that, they hold us back, they pull us. And so like we hide secrets because the truth is, I believed with all of my heart that if you knew that was true about me, if you ever found that out, that immediately you would be disgusted and disapprove and be like, I'm walking away. I can't deal with that. Like I really like that. So I carried that at all costs. Like I would hide that. And ultimately living under the mantra that said, like, listen, I'll be whoever you need me to be. Just don't leave me. And so if it's the guy that's got it together, I'll keep it together. And we'll keep it in the shadows. Maybe it's not in your actions. Maybe it's honestly in your feelings. Like what you're actually processing. Like my wife and I, in Linden, we're in the hospital. I don't remember what time it was at this point, meeting with all these different, 12 different specialists at one point and therapies and combine all that. And there's a moment where we're meeting with the neurologist, trying to figure out what's going on with his brain. And they're just so ambiguous. Like we just don't know. We'll just see. And you want to be like, see what? Like just level with me. What's going on? And there's that we just don't know. Like we don't know if he'll ever graduate high school. We don't know if your son's going to leave your house. We don't know if he'll get married. Like we don't know if you'll be the one to bury him in the next few years. We don't know. And so I remember walking back to my car in the parking garage and leaving my wife with my son in the hospital to go get our daughter. And just being so overwhelmed in a car. And having that moment where you knew that thousands upon thousands of people were praying for your son in your church, nationwide, across the globe. And I remember sitting in the parking garage in my car going, God, if you take my son, you and I are done. Like I'm out. I can't do this. Like we've never asked for anything more. Like we've never put so much energy in prayer, and so either you can't or you won't. And so if you take him, we're done. And in that moment, in a parking garage, I felt like the Lord just drew closer than maybe I've ever felt him. And just embraced me like a father that was allowing me to just pound on his chest and be honest with him. Because it's in that reality that I think we really meet Jesus. Not in all our pretending. Not in all our I'm fine, I'm doing great. Like God knows that. He knows how we're feeling. And I think our doubts and our frustrations have kind of an opportunity to push us into the arms of Jesus or to push us away from Jesus. The question is just, will we be honest? And honesty usually leads us into his presence. So be honest. I'll move fast. I'm so sorry. Point 3, or lie 3, is we got never have enough, be enough. This one will never do enough. So this is the validation junkies, addicted to comparison, performance anxiety, imposter syndrome, completely trying to prove your worth, always. Like needing someone to see you and validate you, that you're a good idea. It's a spirit of slavery. Exodus 32, they build the golden calf. I think ultimately just because they wanted to not really fully rely on God actually doing all the work, that they could be like, hey, we helped build the thing that actually got us out of Egypt. Like we need some type of validation. And we're constantly trying to prove our worth by what we do. And I'll give you, if your day or your mood is affected at any level by criticism, a performance review, good or bad, low attendance on a Sunday morning or a Wednesday night, how many salvations or baptisms you had at camp, or if your success or the success of another ministry that you saw on Instagram affects you, that's a spirit of slavery or orphan. And Stuart said this earlier, God has not asked you to produce any of those results. He's just asked you to abide and be faithful and be obedient. He promises to do all the other work. John 15, you can do nothing outside of me. Your job, just stay close. And then I'll do all the work through you. This is a move from all the responsibility to just responding to God, stepping into the flow and the grace or the circle that He's asked you to occupy. Love that. And I've learned that in this wilderness, God has been killing every part of Drew so that Christ can truly start to live inside of me. But I think they both can't occupy the same space. Jesus is like, you got to move out. So the action and freedom for me is learning to be humble, selfless, self-forgetful. Gosh, so much here. I'll kind of just share this. Several years ago, like in the late 90s, I believe, they did a remake of the old school TV show Little Rascals. I don't know if you saw this, with like Spanky and Buckwheat. And there's this scene in the movie where their treehouse is destroyed, so they're trying to get like lumber, and essentially they like drop all their coins, and it gives them like a toothpick, essentially. And so they see a bank that's giving loans out. And so these 5-year-olds have the great idea to climb on top of each other's shoulders and do the trench coat and the fake beard, and they kind of walk in and they're talking to the account manager and asking for a loan. I want to get a loan. And he's like, what's the account number? And the kid says, 7. And it's like 7. And then one of the kids sticks his head out of the trench coat and it's like, try 8. And what I think is interesting is I think a lot of times, like many of us in adulting, in ministry, in our marriages and parenting, the truth is I think most of us are just a bunch of 5-year-olds wearing adult clothes, trying to fake our way through it. And you're not alone. Like we're all doing it. And I think God is inviting us to just actually humble ourselves, not try to prove ourselves or position ourselves or push ourselves, but simply partner with the Holy Spirit and what He's doing. You and I weren't set free just from something. We were set free to something. You were set free from slavery, but the story doesn't end there. God is moving us into sonship. Like that's the whole revelation of the New Testament. If you were to boil down the theme, is that God is like adoption, moving us into sonship. That's why Jesus comes bearing the title of son. That's not a biological statement. That He came to show you and I what it looks like to be in relationship with the Father. That's why after the cross, He says, I'm not going to leave you as orphans. That's why Paul picks up this whole motif in Galatians chapter 4, Romans chapter 8, that like, hey, you no longer have a spirit of slavery. Stop living like that. Instead, you've been given the Spirit that calls out and reminds you that you are a son, that you're a child, and the Spirit's doing all the work for you. He's crying out, Abba, Father. Like, so live as sons, not as slaves. Don't return to that place. Even Jesus on the cross, who carries the whole weight of the spirit of orphan, even in His final words where He says that, my God, why have you forsaken me? It is a spirit of orphan disconnected from the Father that He carries onto Himself and carries to the tomb and leaves there. And I love that Jesus, when he's baptized in the Jordan, moments before he's carried into the wilderness to go toe-to-toe with Satan, where he actually, all three of the temptations just have to do with, we ever have enough, be enough, or do enough. He tackles those three lies one at a time. And in the Jordan, he's baptized. And he comes out of the water, and everyone around hears the voice of the Father, who says, "This one's mine. This is my Son, whom I love and who I'm really proud of." Jesus hasn't done anything that we'll applaud him for. He hasn't walked on water. He hasn't cast out demons. He hasn't gone to the cross. What is the Father so proud of? He's mine. He hasn't done anything. He doesn't have to perform. He doesn't have to prove himself. That one's mine, and I love him, and I'm proud of him. And I think many of you need to be reminded of that story, that those same words that were spoken over Jesus are spoken over you if you know and love Jesus. You're my child. You're mine. And I love you. And I'm really proud of you. And the truth is, if we don't ever learn to be sons and daughters, then the truth is we'll never be fathers. You can't be a real father until you first learn to be a son. So, you think about 1 Corinthians 4. Paul says it this way. He's like, you've got 10,000, thousands and thousands of mentors, disciplers, guardians. But you know what you don't have? Fathers. By the Spirit of God, Timothy, I've been a father to you. Because the truth is, when you're an orphan, all you can do is help make more orphans. When you're an orphan, you don't know how to build family. And so you know what happens? Our ministries and our churches just look a lot more like orphanages than they do families. Filled with programs and processes, and we can just line them up, get them out, graduate them, send them into the world just to recreate the orphan spirit that we've just been perpetuating over and over again. So how did you become a son? There's really a walk in the spirit of sonship. There's really only one way. And that's not, I wish there was 3 points. It's not the only way I'm learning. Is sonship is all about proximity to the Father. That's it. His presence and his voice are what move us from slavery to sonship. And the more time we spend with the Father, the more we begin to look like a son. We started this whole thing, Jared, with a Rubik's Cube. And what I think is interesting is wherever you find yourself in all your brokenness and all the confusion, twists and turns, this Rubik's Cube, there is nothing special about it. Straight from Amazon, you can see. Little swivelly plastic squares that are attached to something and that centers in the middle. Nothing special. Left on its own, that's as far as it gets. What makes all the difference in the world for the Rubik's Cube is whose hands it finds itself in. The proximity that it finds itself to an actual person that can solve it. My encouragement is wherever you find yourself today, would you be willing to take all of your insecurities, all your doubts, all your fears, all that spirit of slavery and orphan and just go, God, we got a journey ahead, but I'm willing to be brave. I'm willing to be honest. And I'm willing to humble myself and say, you take the lead. And then watch what God does.